This is another episode of Moderate Voices, and today we're going to be discussing education. Recent upheaval in the education nationally and locally. You always hear all these stories about Common Core. Well, like most people, I do not really know. Chuck has a little more experience since he is in academia about understanding it, but we kind of looked into it last week to kind of get a feel for what exactly are the requirements for high school education. So Chuck is going to, and today we're going to be discussing, he was looking at 3 states, Oklahoma, Texas, and I count European style, and
yes you do,
California.
oddly enough.
And we're kind of looking at Common Core, what the requirements are, and some other things. So he's going to kind of go over what exactly do you have to do as a high school student to say, okay, I am a competent individual ready to go into the world. So what do those kind of 3 states say every high school student should be able to do?
Well, in looking at situation, depending on the state, it's either 3 or 4 credits of social studies is required. Of that, only 1 credit seems to be universally across the board required to be U.S. history. The other 3 credits can be varied, although every state does require at least a half credit of their own state history. Like Oklahoma state history in Oklahoma, Texas state history in Texas, and California state history in California.
So to some extent, a credit and a half is kind of universal.
Yeah.
Basically, your state history and U.S. history.
And the key here, though, if we're talking about just high school, the U.S. history that they discuss at this point in high school is only post-revolution, or post-Civil War, from 1878 on. So they start with Reconstruction, and they go to up to current history. And as looking at these guidelines, they state, since there's so much more current history than when we were at school like 30 years ago, there's less emphasis on the earlier history right after Reconstruction. They basically do Reconstruction, then they do the highlights until they get to higher level stuff, looking at how things are described to do. One thing I want to talk about is I think everyone the access to this information is actually not that hard to find.
That is something that I will back him. It was surprisingly easy to find. 1 search, 3 clicks, and I was on it. Now, easy to find does not mean easy to read.
Yes, that is important. But the fact that standards are out there and not hard to find, you can find out what is supposed to be covered in the courses that your children enroll in, and that's important to know. And what is supposed to be stressed in each state. I don't want to get into too much detail because that would take a lot of time. Oklahoma and Texas, not surprisingly, aren't very dissimilar, except for one odd thing. Oklahoma does actually follow the general. They actually use the word Common Core. They have subscribed to the Common Core, at least in some fashion or another, standards for history and government. It says so on the top. That's where they're basing it off of. Texas, there is no mention of Common Core at all. California, actually, I couldn't find any mention of Common Core being a thing. That's a buzzword these days about the Common Core requirements. And I think the middle school confuses. Everybody thinks right now that that's a federal mandate. It's not. The Common Core requirements were agreed upon by states to try to have a universal state thing.
Now,
the federal government doesn't enforce it at all.
I will say this. As just a random citizen, hearing all these different stories that come out about Common Core, all these different problems that schools are having, I've read, once you actually start, when it comes to math, and you've kind of sat down and explained it to me, Common Core is trying to teach the way I think about math.
Well, we'll do a math thing, I think, later.
But reading this, it kind of goes into Common Core. I can't really disagree with what they were saying that Common Core is supposed to stress. Because what Oklahoma is saying Common Core is going to stress is what they call a storyline narrative or a storyline coherency. So instead of going, America was founded in 1778 or whenever it was founded, the Constitution was signed here, it's supposed to go a little more in depth to that, but not so you're supposed to have a story of, okay, what led up to the signing, what happened after the signing, so that as you go to the next class, you kind of have that thread. They keep using this thread and weaving motif in their language that I found really annoying. But it also makes sense.
I do want to state, so Oklahoma and Texas go off this credit system, okay, where you get to choose. California, they have a pretty prescribed sequence of classes you take. They have it listed for grade 10, grade 11, and grade 12, and what you learn in those grades is what you learn. There's like no option. That's what you're taught. So in grade 9, you get, so grade 10, that's when you take your world history, culture, and geography. That's grade 10. Grade 11 is United States history and geography, starting post-Reconstruction time, post-Civil War to the current time. Grade 12 is American democracy and economics, and that's how they have it laid out. There is no, there appears to be no, like with Oklahoma and Texas, there are lots of subclasses, right? Different, where you could take a sociology class, a psychology class. They have listed out an economics class, a world geography class. You get to pick and choose and make your final credit list, whatever you want. California doesn't do that. They have full year-long sequences as defined to cover certain topics. That's just a different way to run it. They want to make sure their students cover certain topics. I find that to be a little interesting that that's how they choose to do things there compared to what we're used to here, which is a kind of a credit system.
It's a credit system where you have to take, these. In Oklahoma, it's, 2 classes are half credits. You have to take those. You have to take U.S. history, and then you have to take a 3rd class of your choice.
Right.
So what I'm seeing is really the difference between Oklahoma and Texas and California, because even with the credit system in those 2 states, you still end up taking roughly the same courses. California requires world history and culture. Texas and Oklahoma
can't skip it.
Not.
That's correct.
In
Texas,
it's pretty much the same.
It is the same. I think it is interesting that California does stress you do have to take. There's no getting around taking something that has to do with the world history, culture, and geography. You don't have to take all 3 of those things into the other 2 states. You can basically pick one of those 3 things and do it. You can do a geography class. You can do a world history class. To make your credits up, you're going to have to do... Or
you can take an economics class and ignore it altogether.
Yes, you could. That is something within the California system. I didn't really see a economics class. Well, that's not true. In the senior year, you do American democracy and economics. And you could say it's little the credits and stuff listed for California they're different. I encourage people to read it. From what I can tell, they're definitely more in light of fitting the United States history or anything else into a worldview, more so than than what I see listed on Oklahoma and Texas.
Which, as far as I can tell, in Oklahoma and Texas, they don't care about the other world. It is,
unless you take a world history class or a world geography class, it's all about
it. Basically, Oklahoma and Texas isn't teaching people how to be a citizen of the world. They're teaching people how to be a citizen of the U.S. Once you graduate, that's when you're supposed to figure out the world and figure out what's going on. And
they're definitely stressing the way it's laid out and the guidelines are laid out. They're definitely stressing more of a American-centric point of view than California does, which is not, it's still centered on American history and it's still centered on American government, but they're doing that in much more stronger relation to how it affects the world stage. And not necessarily as always, there's a couple, both Texas and Oklahoma talk about the rise of the United States becoming a world power. California, they say that, but then there are subsequent stuff. They are more like a leader as opposed to power is what they're stressing, which doesn't sound like a big difference, but actually is. You know what I mean?
Words matter, and we've had this conversation before. If you can control the words of the argument, you win the argument.
Now, as I told Jason, I tried to get textbooks to look at actual textbooks because that's really the critical thing here. If you read these standards, the standards themselves, if you actually read each one in particular, they're not really going to rile you up or make you think that they're bad, or even really leaving stuff out. What you're going to be upset about is what textbooks stress, because there are, I mean, it just easily on the Oklahoma set, because that's what Jason knows. There's within United States history, the actual history class, there's 5 main ingredients, but under each one of those 5 core competencies, there's like a list of what is it, A through let's say 1 through 10, and then like A through H on each one or something like that. There's like 20 or 30, about 20 subsequent topics they have to cover that are listed as things that should be covered by within the stuff. Well, let's be honest, this is a 1-year class in high school, which doesn't go at the same pace as at college. They're not going to cover every single thing in there. They get a textbook, which whoever the textbook writer is going to have it written in a way where they emphasize certain aspects of these things. That's the thing where you can get into an issue. And I think that's where a lot of people have trouble with American history, is they feel like they leave out certain people or certain events and have other certain events in there. And they blame the standards for it instead of actually blaming the textbook authors and the people who approve the textbooks that they get from on the school board level, saying that it's okay that you talk about Martin Luther, specific heroes of this. I told you, like, was it Texas wants you to learn about General Pershing?
Yeah.
Weird.
And I have to admit, at the time and the rate in which you were supposed to be learning about General Pershing, fine, wonderful. Who cares?
Yeah. And so a textbook may not stress him. Most people wouldn't care. But what if you get a book that decides that, these military leaders, because all the great militaries, Eisenhower is also listed as someone you should know about.
Well, Eisenhower you should know about. Not
he's also president.
Because he's a military leader, because...
He ended up being a president. But they could stress certain aspects, and that's where I've seen the most complaint about American history and these new guidelines leading towards testing and stuff, because they feel that they've left out critical aspects. Everybody feels they leave out critical aspects.
And to some extent, you have to.
Yes.
Because
there's not enough time.
We've been sitting here talking 3 course credits: U.S. history, government, Oklahoma history, 1 other credit. How are you going to learn everything you're supposed to know about history in 4 classes? And I think that's
and then I personally feel that there is not enough stress on. We talk about in current times, people talk about the founding fathers and what they intended. Well, the last time anyone officially really studies pre-Civil War history is 8th grade. You noted, and everything has like a little blurb to talk about the founding of the country when they go into certain classes. But they're only going to do that.
I didn't say that. What I said is the week of November the 11th is Freedom Week in Oklahoma.
Yeah, and that's actually a national thing. That's in Texas as well, and that's also in California. And they do...
In which they are supposed to go back and discuss the Declaration of Independence. They're supposed to go back and discuss the Constitution.
But, I mean, that's 1 week. That's only 1 week of discussion.
It is only 1 week.
And you're only going to... At that point, you're really hitting highlights. You're definitely not hitting the actual what was really happening. What were the events surrounding this? You're just going over the major events, not the context. And that's what everybody's argument about founding fathers and when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they wrote the Constitution, the context of what they were writing and interpreting it. Well, nobody really talks about that any more in depth past the 8th grade. And I'll be honest, in 8th grade, how old is an average 8th grader? Like 12?
Always add 5, so 13.
So 13?
Yeah.
That's some pretty deep philosophical thought processes for a 13-year-old to really get.
It is.
And then a lot of people think that this should be picked up in college. And I'll tell you, from my personal perspective, going back to college, and it's still the same way now, there's only one, in your core requirements, you're only required to take 1 history class, and you're allowed to choose pre-Civil War or post-Civil War history.
Well, no. Screw this. College... We're discussing most of these people. Are we discussing college-bound students or non-college-bound students?
If your argument is that the person is supposed to pick up this information that they've lost since they were 13 years old in going to college, my thing there is that's fool's gold of a thought because, 1, not all of them are going. You're right. A lot of them aren't going to be going. They're just going to be going to maybe a vo-tech school or just no college at all and just going to go try to get a job. So their last exposure to any deep thought about the founding of the country was when they were 13. Then if you think that, okay, a lot of them are going to go to college these days, they still don't have to take any about that there. They can get away with just taking post-Civil War, which I know anecdotal evidence, but I work at a university. The post-Civil War history classes have more students in them than the pre-Civil War history classes do.
Well, kind of as you stated, in high school, in later years, when they're 14, 15, and 16, they've taken post-Civil War. You're going to take the class that's going to get you the credit to graduate, that's going to be easiest in your opinion.
Yes.
The easiest is what you already know the most about. Well, yeah, if you took it at 13, you probably have forgotten the Founding Fathers. Now, because you always hear about this argument. What did they mean? This is people quote them out of context.
Yes,
They definitely take a preconceived notion of what the Founding Fathers should have meant, and then make sure that is what they meant.
That is a problem I have with that. I think, in a way, the way California's is set up and laid out, they take some sort of either history, government, or social studies class every year of high school, both freshman, sophomore.
But as you stated as well, they don't discuss the.
They don't. The later ons, they get to U.S. government in the senior year, the idea of democracy and economics, which is, in a way, possibly the most important thing for a 17, 18-year-old to get when they're going to be exposed to how our government works. I don't mind that order of things. But they're actually they take history in the 11th grade. And in the 10th grade, they take world history. That's their order. I can see that actually isn't so bad. At least they've had it when they were like 17 years old. They've had at least the post-Civil War history. But again, it still doesn't fill in the gap of how our country was created. As everybody has noted, there's all post-Civil War, especially post-World War I and post-World War II, very contentious times. And that's very easy to get partisan textbooks without intent. And I think that happens a lot. You know what I mean by that?
No.
Well, it's like
I think you are underestimating the intent of partisanship.
Well, I am to some extent, in the sense that I think people's textbooks, there are some textbooks that are very slanted and very intentionally written in the way they are. And some of them are probably slanted some, but end up being slanted more than intended, I think is what I mean. It's like towards thinking of the U.S. as being eminently powerful, or our role in which, the U.S. history is, we're a very important player on the stage since about 1880. 1885, the United States has been an extremely important player on the international stage, and growing stronger over time. Prior to the Civil War, the United States, honestly, and that's why most people stress, and that's I feel it's prior to the Civil War, and after Reconstruction, when we started doing the expansion.
I wouldn't even necessarily say we were that big of a player in the 1880s.
Well, that's what you're looking at textbooks, I would feel that Reconstruction and stuff like that gets a chapter, and then they skim over everything until you get to World War I. And even looking at the standards, there's not a lot until you get to World War I of U.S. history that's kind of taught. I mean, they hit stuff, but nothing major, because they stress when we became a player on the world stage more, and that your perspective on that is different on the textbooks. I don't, looking at the standards, I don't think the standards themselves are why you might feel that our country's attitude about history and how things are slanted. It's not based on standards, and I don't think it's based on standards in any of the country, in any of those states. I mean, in terms of the standards as written, you really, they're not that, the California standards versus the Texas standards are not that dissimilar.
Well, the other question, and this is kind of what we're establishing. Every state has their standards, and it sounds like every state's kind of similar in their standards. Is implementation of those standards, and this is not what we were looking at. We were looking at the standards. What is required. Now, I did while we were doing this, I did actually find out that Oklahoma requires that the high school students have 2 classes, or not really classes, but competencies before they graduate. That we've talked about that I think high schools should be more. They require that they be personal financial literacy requirements.
Yes, that is listed as one of the things they have in an Oklahoma type class. Texas also has a thing like that listed as a thing that they have at the very end of their set of standards. They call it let me read the name for it here.
Because we have talked about people
personal financial literacy
poor financial decisions, and they do make very poor financial decisions. And I've always thought that they make it because they don't understand. They don't realize what's going on. So if we can teach high school students, emulating your parents may not be the best decision. And Oklahoma also requires that every student know CPR, basic CPR, and automated electrodefibrillator, or what does the AED stand for?
Yeah, I think that's it. Auto and stuff. I don't know. To be able to use a CPR machine as well as
it's not the CPR machine. It's the automated machine that they have. All you got to do is stick it on there, and if it detects the heart needs a shock, it will shock them. If it doesn't, it won't.
Right. That's interesting. I don't see anything like that in Texas or in California. Texas does have a class on personal financial literacy. California lists nothing on personal financial literacy in their list of course requirements. From 9 through 12.
Because as the larger scale of education, what is the purpose of education? And before you answer, I'm going to give you my thoughts, because I think there's 2 purposes for education. 1, get you to where you can work a job. And then 2, the philosophical side, educate you to where you can be a productive member of society, which that is different than necessarily working. A productive member of society, someone involved in the arts, who entertains, who gets children out of trouble, that's a very productive member of society that may or may not have a job. So
I see where you're going with that. I think education. I personally like that both Texas and Oklahoma have a personal financial literacy class. We've discussed this off air, off recording. That is a big problem. People don't know how to handle the money. Now, this type of class or this type of topic has been covered for years. I mean, I don't know if you remember when we had this, but I had something like that in high school before I went at my home back in Chandler. We had and that was like something that was covered as well.
We had basic. Well, my old high school had basic accounting, but as you stated, it was optional.
Well, mine was actually worked into a couple classes. It was worked into.
I don't remember anything that was non-optional, but part of that might be because of my mindset. I was taking courses out of sync, and
that's
that
very
might have been
possible.
causing some issues because I was skipping over math requirements to take higher level math requirements just because
you could. Yeah. No, but I do find it interesting that California doesn't have anything about that. I think that's something that's kind of missing. But now Oklahoma has a test put in, so they have to show competency in that. So even though it's an elective, they kind of have to do something with it. Texas doesn't have anything like that as a test. They don't require you to show anything. You just have to, pass your Texas general requirement exams to get the degree, which it might be in there in some capacity, but it wouldn't be anything more than just basic arithmetic type stuff.
Yeah. So in other words, you could take the class and know nothing. So that's and as this web episode is probably. Or the vlog, or whatever we call this, as you probably have noticed, this is a very general. We are starting the exploration process. Chuck is going to find some textbooks, so we can kind of look at some textbooks and see if there's anything that's just kind of.
It'd be nice. I don't think I'll have any trouble getting a Texas high school textbook because I live in Texas. If you could try to find a way to get an Oklahoma textbook, that would be kind of good. I don't know. Maybe if your mom or that would be nice. And a California textbook, that might be kind of hard to pull off. Textbooks, as you guys might know.
You know people in California, ring them up.
Well, they'd have to have access to somebody's textbook to borrow from a school. Textbooks are not that easy to find online. PDFs of, especially high school versions. College versions are even really hard to find. Textbook manufacturers, and that's something I want to do someday.
So
talk about the
in
evil
the future,
textbook
our follow-up right now, our plan is to get some textbooks from definitely the 2 states we live in. Maybe California, maybe one of the purple states, Colorado or Florida. We might have a chance at Colorado.
Yeah, that's a real possibility.
I don't know anybody.
I could try to say Florida, for whatever reason, they were the one state that I ran into trouble getting their information. Wasn't quite as easy to get to.
Yeah,
but I think it was just a matter of
having to
do it.
As far as education goes, when you learn your state history and you learn all about your state and you don't travel much, because I didn't travel much when I was younger. When I was in that formative, 15 to 25 years, I've gone traveling here lately. Oklahoma, the United States is not as
not uniform.
I'm thinking, uniform, but I'm thinking of the homogeneous or.
Yeah, there's an argument when we took the class that Oklahoma, the United States is a melting pot, and things have kind of that the idea was it was a melting pot of all these immigrants and all this stuff, and that it's kind of mixed in homogeneous.
Kind of like a soup, though. You got a meaty part that kind of goes down here. You got a potato part. The potato doesn't break apart and become a liquid across all. No, it stays. Yeah, it's all in the same soup, but certain.
Which you can tell this situation with looking at political maps of representation in Congress that the United States is definitely not homogenous. It's definitely not
Yes. There's
definitely not the kind of situation where things are similar from one state to the next. Because they're definitely not. That's why looking at California is.
So, what we're going to do is we're going to get some textbooks, and we're going to see if anything in the textbooks are just completely off, and from there, start making a decision, start having an opinion. Because right now, our opinion is education is important. That's a great opinion.
We're talking, and I think what we looked here.
So, this wraps up this episode. And we will see you guys next episode.
All right. Yep. See ya.
This is another